This is part 3 of the English colonialism lecture. Again, your professor is kind of a technological idiot, and somehow I didn't save the lecture that I gave in class. So I am redoing this on the fly on my front porch. So if it sounds a little different than it did in class, not a big deal. The next plantation colony I want to talk about is Maryland. Maryland is quite a bit different from Virginia. First off, Maryland was established as a proprietary colony. If you don't know what a proprietary colony is, that is a colony that was created solely to make profit. It's a colony that's owned by one individual or one small group of individuals. This guy, George Calvert or Lord Baltimore, they're the same person. Lord Baltimore is his title. George Calvert's his name. Was granted this charter from the King of England in 1632. And the way he went about getting this is interesting. Lord Baltimore had loaned the King of England a great deal of money to finance his explorations and wars. This is a time when the monarchy in England was approaching bankruptcy, and they were forced to take out loans from some of their larger land barons. Lord Baltimore was one of these guys. Lord Baltimore also just so happened to be a Catholic, and the Catholics were causing a great deal of difficulty for the crown. While it wasn't illegal to be a Catholic at this point, it did create problems because Catholics did not recognize the King of England as the head of the church. They recognized the Pope as the head of the church. So you're actually somewhat decaying the power base of the king. And he would just as soon have gotten rid of the Catholics. And he saw a chance here to solve two problems. One, get out of debt with Lord Baltimore. And two, get Catholics off the Big Island. So he agrees to give him this land in the New World as a proprietary colony in exchange for, first, erasing his debt, and second, for establishing a Catholic colony, a safe place where the Catholics of England could go and worship as they wished. So the deal was made. Lord Baltimore moves to Maryland. It's a much better location than Jamestown, much healthier. It's not a swamp, but the land is very similar to Jamestown. The climate is very similar to Jamestown, and tobacco grows well in Maryland as well. So tobacco is going to be the main crop there. His plan was to establish this as a feudal colony. If you don't know what feudalism is, that's a system of government where it's divided into kings and their vassals, and kings grant land to vassals in exchange for service and loyalty. Vassals grant land to lower vassals or peasants in exchange for service, loyalty, or taxes. It's really a pretty good way to manage and control a large area, and that was his plan. He was going to be an absentee proprietor living himself in England, and to do this, he granted huge tracts of land in Maryland to his Catholic relatives. Here's the problem. He intended to sell the rest of this land in order to make money, but colonists would not come to Maryland if they weren't given free land. They had too many other options out there where they could. So the colonists that did come were given modest farms right around the Chesapeake Bay region. Okay, they're not large, but they're large enough that you can make a little bit of money, and Lord Baltimore and his vassals could build their tax base and start charging property taxes. And the thought was that they would be successful. They would then need more land for more tobacco, and they would have to purchase it from the feudal lords. Since they used tobacco as their primary crop, by the late 1600s, black slaves began to be imported. Now, Your textbook, and all textbooks really, make a big deal about how Maryland was a haven for Catholics, a safe place for Catholics. And it was. He permitted a great deal of religious freedom by the standards of the time. The problem is, a lot of Protestants moved to Catholic Maryland. In fact, so many that soon the Protestant masses overwhelmed the Catholic land barons. And this is going to mean that the Catholic land barons are going to have to be proactive about their religious toleration. So they passed the Toleration Act of 1649. Now, to tolerate a religion means not to endorse it, but to allow it, okay? So they passed this law, which was, again, pretty far-thinking for the time period, a great deal of religious freedom for 1649. Today, we would not call this religious toleration at all. We would almost call it a theocracy today. Because while this was supported by the Catholics in Maryland, and while your textbook points out that it was there to protect the rights of even the Protestants, in reality, it was the Catholic minority that was in charge passing this law while they were still in charge, because they were afraid if they didn't pass a Toleration Act, that at some point the Protestants would so overwhelm them that they would make it illegal to be a Catholic even in Maryland. So, what does this Toleration Act say? It says that you are free to worship any religion you want, so long as it believes that Jesus Christ is a divine being. You have to be some kind of Christian, in other words. You could be Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Papist, Anti-Barrowist, whatever you want, as long as you believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and God himself. If you did not believe that, if you were, say, an atheist or even a Jew, both of those do not believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Atheists don't believe in a God at all. And the Jewish people believe that Jesus of Nazareth was a great rabbi, a great prophet, a great man, but not the Son of God. In Maryland, you would be executed for this. The sentence for not believing in the deification of Jesus was death. So in some ways, this was actually less tolerant than it was before. I gave you a copy of the Toleration Act in your notes. You can read it. It's quite long, and that's all one sentence. In the class, I read the whole thing. I'm not going to read it all to you here. But you can see that in this ridiculous run-on sentence, they basically say that if you speak in a reproachful manner or speak bad about anybody that and it says resides, traffics, trades, or commerces within this province, within its ports, harbors, creeks, or havens. So anybody in the Maryland area, and then goes off and has this long list of different types of Christians: heretic, schismatic, idolater, Puritan, Presbyterian, so on. And finally, it says at the end of this that you'll lose the sum of 10 shillings for each offense, including if your slave does it, you're responsible. And if you cannot pay the sum, and the second paragraph there, it says that they were to be, quote, publicly whipped and imprisoned without bail until, quote, he, she, or they shall satisfy the party so offended. Pretty amazing stuff. All right, the next section I want to get into is the settlement of New England. And I want to start off by looking at these two terms, separatist and Puritan. I know you've probably always heard the term Pilgrim and Puritan. I don't like the term Pilgrim. A pilgrim is technically anyone who travels for a religious reason. That's why Muslims can take a pilgrimage to the Hajj. They're pilgrims. That's why if you decide to get in your car and drive to Dallas for a church service, you are a pilgrim that day. So I don't like that term. I like the term separatist better. Separatists believe that the Church of England is so corrupt that it cannot be fixed. And what they think corrupted it was the Catholic faith, that when the Church of England broke from Catholicism, it didn't break hard enough. It kept all the vestiges of Catholicism. It kept the robes and the titles and the Latin Mass and the incense burning and all the calisthenics during the exercise, or during the ceremony. Stand up, sit down, all that stuff. They didn't like that. They want to go back to a simpler time. And they think that the only way to do that is to separate and create another, more primitive, truer church. The Puritans have the same beliefs. They're Calvinists, just like the Separatists are, but they do not think the Church of England is so damaged that it can't be fixed. They're called Puritans because they also want to get rid of that, but they want to get rid of it inside the church. They want to purify the Church of England. Okay? Again, Puritans and Separatists are Calvinists. We went over Calvinism in the Age of Discovery. I'm not going to go over it all here, but basically, Calvinists believe in predestination, that you are either predestined for heaven or doomed to hell before you're ever born. The argument is that if God is all-knowing and all-powerful, God must already know whether you're going to heaven and hell and have the power to choose one way or the other. So he is allowing some people to be damned. This is going to create a lot of problems. I have just lost my spot on this slide, so give me a second to get back to where I'm supposed to be. I am such a technological idiot when it comes to this kind of stuff. So, these Separatists and the Puritans as well believe that only the visible saints should be admitted to church membership. That's those people that are obviously of the elect. This is kind of contradictory to the Calvinistic idea, because in true Calvinism, no one knows if they are of the elect. The Separatists didn't like the fact that in the Church of England, everyone was enrolled in the church. All the king's subjects were in. They were all paying taxes to the church, and they felt like they were sharing the church with the damned. So they're not going to be supporters of this. The Pilgrims, or the Separatists in 1620 that set off on the Mayflower, were not setting off as we have always been told because they wanted religious freedom. I know that's what you've been taught your whole life. It's the same story I've been told. But there's so many holes in that idea. They did leave, 102 of them, about half of them were Separatists, left on the Mayflower. They had negotiated with the Virginia Company and the permission of the king to settle in Virginia. They are captained by Miles Standish, and they, according to legend at least, this Mayflower is heading across the ocean. It gets blown off course. It doesn't find Virginia. Instead, it lands a long way north in what's today Massachusetts, in a place they're going to call Plymouth Plantation, or what we always just called Plymouth Rock. Now, we're told that that these settlers or Separatists on the Mayflower ran their ship aground, hitting this large boulder, Plymouth Rock, and as the ship was sinking, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, the first English law in the history of North America, and in fact became squatters in a new world. Well, okay, let's talk about that story a little bit. First off, let's go back to the religious freedom idea. These same Pilgrims had already left England before and gone to Holland, where they had absolute religious freedom. It wasn't religious freedom they wanted. It was everybody else to worship the same religion they had. That's kind of the opposite of religious freedom. They didn't like the fact that their kids were becoming too Dutch. So they came back to England before setting off on this Mayflower expedition. Next, we're expected to believe they made it all the way across the ocean, looking for Virginia, but got so blown off course they end up in Massachusetts. that seems unlikely to me. This wasn't a strange place for them. English sailors had been fishing off the coast of Cape Cod for decades by this point. They knew what was in Massachusetts. They had gone ashore there to get fresh supplies and fresh water before. It wasn't an unknown wilderness. It was an area that the English had been to before. They just hadn't settled before. And then we're expected to believe they hit this boulder, and while the ship was sinking, they took the time to draft the Mayflower Compact with beautiful calligraphy and iambic pentameter. I can't believe that. I think these guys, in fact, intended to come. By the way, if you haven't read the Mayflower Compact, it is worth reading. It's written in November of 1620. It was, at least according to legend, written and signed before the Pilgrims even disembarked from the ship. I kind of question that. It's got all the hallmarks of something that was written and a lot of time was taken on, and I don't think you would take the time to write something like that while your ship was sinking. I think they had written this law on the way over, or maybe even before they left England, and agreed to it, which creates a different problem. If they're trying to go to Virginia, where there's already a law, why do you need a Mayflower Compact? So I kind of wonder about this document. Let's talk about the theology a little bit more of the covenant theology, the theology of the Calvinists or the Puritans and Separatists. They had what's called a social covenant. They believed that it was the duty of all Puritans to watch out for all Puritans. It's what we call mutual watchfulness. It is your duty to observe. There is no toleration for deviance. There's no toleration for disorder. There's no privacy. You were expected to be the same person in private as you are in public, because there was no private. Okay? When I say no toleration of deviancy, I mean exactly what that sounds like. There was no homosexuality. There was no adultery. There was no theft. None of this was tolerated, and it was put down harshly, whether it be from the stocks or the pillory, where you were, where you were locked up in the wooden stocks, and people came by and shunned you and threw food at you and spit on you, or if you were convicted of adultery. If you've read Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, you know that the heroine in that story has a sexual affair with a minister, and her punishment is she has to sew a white A on her clothes and wear it for the rest of her life, so people knew she was an adulteress. Well, that's not exactly the way it happened. In reality, more than likely what they would do is take a hot iron and brand an A on your forehead or your chest where everybody could see it, usually your forehead. And the scarlet A was the whelp that comes up from a burn, the scar that's there that would be there for the rest of your life. Not a fun group of people to be with. Their first year, 1620, 1621, had a harsh winter. In fact, so harsh that out of the 102 that had left England, only 44 survived the winter. They were not prepared for a Massachusetts winter. They were prepared for a Virginia winter, not understanding that Massachusetts was rockier. The soil was not as good for crops, and the weather gets much harsher in Massachusetts than in Virginia. That having been said, in 1621, when the Mayflower sailed back to England, not a single one of them chose to sail back with it. That shows something. Plymouth stays small. It never gets large. It never gets to be this vast colony like its sister colony, Massachusetts Bay, that we're going to talk about, it does. In fact, by 1691, 70 years after being founded, there's only 7,000 people in Plymouth, and it's kind of sucked into its sister colony. It becomes part of Massachusetts Bay, which was centered in Boston. I think that's kind of where I left off today, and that's about a 20-minute version of about an hour-long lecture I gave today. But I think I hit the high points. If I didn't, then feel free to email me, text me, call me, whatever you need to do, and I'll answer whatever questions you have. All right, guys, thank you for listening.